How did I come interested in this subject? It simply falls within my professional expertise. I had come from Britain, where I had worked extensively on the British archives in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. I came to the University of Hong Kong in 2009, and I felt that since I was in Hong Kong, I was in the area of the South China Sea, and this was an issue that affected the South China Sea and was important to the Chinese, had important international implications. I wonder what there is in these archives about ownership of the South China Sea islands. I am looking at this question of the South China Sea islands not in terms of the Chinese view of their history, but in terms of the Western view of international law. The basis of ownership is the fact that the islands are part of the Chinese homeland. The British and French archives have a different character. The British don't have any greedy fingers on any of the possessions of the Chinese in the South China Sea, either the Shisha or the Nansha Islands. They have taken the view that, which was shared in the beginning by the French, that in 1909 or so, a Chinese admiral and a Chinese official delegation made a formal assertion of sovereignty and ownership over the Paracel Islands, that is the Shisha Islands. Trouble really begins when Aristide Briand, the foreign minister, said to make a claim to the Paracels in French and to see how the Chinese react. The French deliberately seized the Paracel Islands against the legal advice of their ministry. And the legal advice continued to be that if there was an arbitration, that the Paracels would be awarded to China, that the French had acquiesced in the Chinese sovereign claim to the Paracels in 1909, and that the 1931 assertion of ownership by the French was manifestly contrary to its own practice. With the Spratlys or the Nansha Islands, it's a little bit more complicated. The British had thought of claiming the Nansha Islands for themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century. When they realized that the French were also making a claim to the Nansha Islands, the British investigated, asked for a legal opinion as to whether or not they themselves had any claim to the Nansha Islands, and they decided that they did not. The circumstances of the French making a claim to the Nansha Islands are almost comical, because the French government in Paris never took a decision to occupy the Nansha Islands. This was a unilateral action by a naval officer in the Indochina administration. And the French Foreign Ministry learned about it after they read about it in, I think, Hong Kong newspapers. The United States appears on the scene after the Second World War. The defunct character and defective character of the San Francisco so-called Treaty of Peace is an essential part of the chaos of the East Asia. In the preparation for that conference, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the American Armed Forces, along with John Foster Dulles, informed Truman that it would be unacceptable for the South China Sea Islands, under any circumstances, to be restored to China, because it was essential to contain China and keep it out of these islands. This is on the record. My point is that that is not the institutional memory of France and Britain, and that their legal conscience should require them to admit publicly that the Chinese claims to the islands are historically valid in Western international law terms. So it's really a case of double standards applying to China, not for the first time. The West applies international law in a very kind of selective way, and where international law supports a country they don't like China, then they don't apply it. And this meeting that took place recently between Japan, the Philippines, and Washington, I think is a particularly offensive and obscene meeting. They're simply using it as a stick with which to beat China. So it is very clear that the Americans have decided that the Western Pacific is a part of the world that they have to be able to control. And they have to be the dominant power in that area. So legal issues are really a matter of secondary importance. They are creating chaos for the sake of it, in order to promote and foment disagreements and differences in the area, which they can then use to weaken China. What is a feature of international relations at the moment, which for me as an international lawyer is not a mark of progress, is that part of the propaganda war that goes on is for each country to try to label the other country as breaking international law. We call that lawfare. It's a form of verbal abuse. And I think that the importance of my research is to strengthen the Chinese position that they are simply, in Western terms, insisting on incontestable legal rights. There is a really chaotic, manipulative use of international law, which is a form of lawlessness, which is represented, in my opinion, by the South China Sea arbitration of 2016. The Philippines and the tribunal played a legal trick and decided that the islands were not islands for the purposes of the convention, and it could be ignored, which is bizarre, kind of Humpty Dumpty approach to law. So this tribunal suddenly decided that provision of the Article 121, paragraph 3 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which provided that rocks which do not support human habitation cannot generate maritime rights. The tribunal said, well, obviously the South China Sea islands are not rocks, but they were once rocks. And with all the bad weather and all the sea beating up against the rocks, they have become sand. And so they are really fall within Article 1213, and they are, for all practical purposes, equivalent to rocks, which is manifestly absurd. My personal view would be that it would be appropriate for France and Britain to be challenged on their alleged neutrality over the issue of the ownership of the South China Sea islands. It's quite clear that China has the prior claim to the islands, and that they are islands.